This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Granger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Create the deck of your dreams now at Menards. Spend less time maintaining your deck and more time enjoying it with Ultra Deck low-maintenance composite decking from Menards. It's easy to install and built to last. Plus, get free estimates fast with our deck design program in-store and on Menards.com. Save big on Ultra Deck and check out more great deals happening now at Menards.
Save big money at Menards.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, let's go not overseas, but just south of the border. One of our neighbors. We're going to talk a little about Mexico, but our guest that's joining us is actually a little further south than that. Costa Rica, one of the real beautiful places in the Western Hemisphere. I got a buddy of mine who lives down there, keeps wanting me to visit. I'm going to have to take him up on that. Gabriel Salazar Singh. We're going from the oldest, youngest voice, which is me, to the youngest voice. Gabriel, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Appreciate your time today. All right. For folks that don't know, you've been writing in International Policy Digest. What's been going on south of the border? Because other than the border stuff and immigration stuff that we talk about in the United States and it gets a lot of play, obviously the stuff with Governor Abbott right now, that's all border policy stuff. But what actually goes on in Mexico doesn't get as much press here. The president down there, AMLO, I'm going to let you pronounce it, not me. That's the abbreviation. There's been some news with him, and you've been writing about just big picture wise, just to set the scene for it. Let people know what the current state of play in Mexican politics in the country is right now with President AMLO.
Yes. So to summarize it quickly, my piece, as you mentioned, published in International Policy Digest, I denounce our Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO for short, has acted in a populist manner to grip much more power than the president already has in Mexican politics. He sought to delegitimize the press, Mexican institutionality, reform the constitution to his favor. He has revealed a journalist's salary on a presidential conference and called for a nonsensical referendum on whether or not he should remain in power for longer, which in my opinion will only help polarize Mexico, even though it already happened. I think that the effects, we will not see them until the 2024 elections.
Now, when he originally ran, he ran on an anti-corruption platform. It's a different kind of populism because obviously there's cultural differences and the system of government's different, but you could say it was a populist campaign. He was big on the anti-corruption. We know the issues long before him, issues in Mexico. Corruptions, of course, are always dealing with criminal elements, these sorts of things. And it's kind of a, how would you describe, let's just pull up and park here for a second because it's important for people to understand the Mexican style of government that they have right now. How would you explain it to an American audience that's used to our, pretty strong federal system where the states have a lot of power, the federal government has a lot of power, and there's conflict there? Decentralized is kind of the wrong term, but it is kind of a unique system. Just explain the system of government for just a minute so that we have a base of understanding of what these things that he's doing means.
Yes, so as you mentioned before, Mexico has a federalized system of government. They, of course, have the office of the president. They have a legislative body, which is composed, or it's a cameral legislative body of government. They have the Senate and the lower chamber of Congress. They have a judicial system, which I believe has been a root of most of the troubles in governance in Mexico, because even academics say that the judicial system in Mexico is extremely weak, and constitutional reforms over the years have helped weaken the power of the judicial system.
Now, since those judicial system is various weeks, we see that on the news, unfortunately, with some of the violence and some of those issues. What does the average Mexican think when they go to vote electorally? You talked about the constitutional reform process, but day in and day out, we're doing a midterm cycle, and we understand that sets up our presidential election in 2024. As the Mexican citizen is looking at this, do they see this as, because again, AMLO ran as a non-systemics, the term you use. He ran anti-corruption. He was going to change the system, but it seems like now he's just changing the system to fit his means and his wants. What's the average citizen in Mexico thinking when they go to vote in this particular cycle? Do they have hope, or is it more we're stuck with this and we don't know what else to do and we don't have a better option?
So let me give you some context first. In the article, I mentioned the concept of the perfect dictatorship. It's a concept that a Peruvian author violently denounced in Mexican television back in the 90s. In the beginning of the 90s, I think, where he said that Mexico was the perfect dictatorship, not because it functioned well as a dictatorship and because there was the permanence of power of a single individual, but because there was the permanence of power of a single party, and they disguised it perfectly as a democracy. They, however, penetrated all aspects of Mexican culture, their system. For example, the opposition parties were financed by the main party, the government party, the PRI, which tells you how much of an opposition they were. They used nationalism to polarize people. It was so systematic that even the owner of Televisa, the news channel back then and even now, called himself a proud soldier of El PRI. In the Enrique de la Madrid elections in the 90s, 80s, I don't precisely recall when he was elected, they made sure to cover all of his events. And his opponent wasn't really covered by the press. Now, it wasn't until the election of Felipe Calderón that the PRI lost the elections. Then came another party, El PAN, and those were established as the two main traditional parties in Mexico. Now, as you mentioned before, that corruption is rampant in Mexico. Gang violence through the cartels is extremely high, and the people are obviously tired of that. In the 2018 elections, they demonstrated that by voting in Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, with a 53% of people who voted for him. You said that he ran as a populist, but he has governed as a populist as well. Before this referendum asking if he should resign or not from power, he had another referendum asking the citizens whether the ex-presidents, the former presidents still alive, should be taken into trial for corruption or whatever, for their actions, which obviously goes against the liberal democracy order of the separation of powers. It's the presidential system, or the presidential figure, penetrating the judicial system, getting into something that is not in his incumbents to be in. Now, this referendum, the newer one, which was held some days ago, only 20% of the people went to vote, which tells you how apathetic the people are towards voting. 80% didn't want to vote, didn't want to participate in the elections, or in the voting of the referendum, which tells you that people are also tired. They are not only tired of the corruption in Mexico, but they have lost a lot of faith. And I think that that's one of the things that starts to erode democracy around the world, not only in Mexico, when people start getting tired of what they have been presented, that they have been manipulated by many governments. And yes, that's basically it to answer your question. I hope I answered it correctly.
No, you did fine. When you wrote in the piece about it, again, we'll be linking to your piece in International Policy Digest. I've had things published there before. You mentioned that they had actually downgraded Democracy Index report. They bumped Mexico down from a flawed democracy, that's their term, to a hybrid regime, labeling Obrador and a liberal populist. We just talked about the populist label and what it means. Because, and this is you writing here, because of his disregard for democratic norms and his continued efforts to concentrate power in the executive branch. Illiberal populist, I think, is a fantastic term, but that hybrid regime term, you mentioned it before. Let's loop back to it for just a second, though. Having the pretense of democracy, having the pretense, he's using the referendum system a lot here. That hybrid regime, I think, is a label that should be applied to this, maybe a little bit more than populism, because populism's the movement to get the political power of the people involved. But the hybrid regime is kind of the nuts and bolts of this, is like, hey, we're going to use the democratic process to become authoritative. It's just the last vote is going to be to make us authoritative for life. That hybrid regime seems like a really good way of explaining that, and that's a great term for it.
Yes, I agree. I think that it's highly it's worrying that an institution as serious as The Economist and their index has labeled the Mexican democracy going down. And you've got to see all aspects of government and how AMLO has penetrated them. The Supreme Court president is in favor of him, or has been said to be in favor of him. He controls both chambers of Congress and many democracies in Latin America. So we know about the separation of power between the three branches: the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. But many countries in Latin America, we could consider that the fourth power of government is their electoral institution. I think that it's worrying that AMLO wants to have constitutional reforms be made to change their electoral institution. For example, they want to. So think of it like this: in a perfect democracy, you'd rather have technical people running a central bank. You'd rather have technical people running the electoral institution. But one of the reforms AMLO wants to make is that the people elect those who are in charge of the electoral institution. And he says, each branch of government should propose 20 candidates so that the people have 80 candidates they can choose from. Now, look at it this way. We mentioned the apathy towards voting. Only 20% voted in this referendum, which means that only those who really support him have participated in the country's elections. And imagine it this way. I'm not sure if you agree with Mr. Trump's proposals and what he has said after January 6th, but imagine if the United States elections were polarized that way, so that the people elect those who are in charge of vying that they are free and fair elections, and that some people run with the idea of turning the elections towards Donald Trump. This is one of the main problems it presents. Institutions like this shouldn't be polarized. Never, under any circumstance, should the central bank be polarized or politicized. And same goes for autonomous institutions such as the Electoral Institute.
Yeah, we're talking to our friend Gabriel Salazar Singh. He's down in Costa Rica, but we're talking about Mexico, our neighbor to the south, or to the north for him. When we come back after the break on Heard Tell, we're going to continue to talk about some of those other institutions like the press, some very alarming things involving the press down south in Mexico. Also going to talk about that apathy a little bit of a disparaging thing there. You only got 20% voting, but AMLO's popularity remains high. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what he calls the anti-systematic platforms. More with Gabriel Salazar Singh on Heard Tell right after this.
For the ones who know safety isn't a catchphrase, it's a culture. And the ones who help make sure everyone makes it home safe. For the safety-minded who watch everyone's backs, Grainger offers supplies and solutions for every industry, as well as safety assessments and training to keep your facilities safe and your people safer. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Welcome back to Heard Tell, talking to our friend Gabriel Salazar Singh, talking a little bit about Mexico politics, some things going on, some very troubling developments in the current reign of President AMLO. We talked about some of those, non-official institutions in America. We often talk about the press, the free press being an institution. But in Mexico, you already touched on it a little bit. There's been some really disturbing stuff in Mexico. As you listed in your piece, there's been at least 6 journalists, prominent German journalists, murdered just in this year alone. We had the incident with Obrador. I still think I'm saying that wrong, but AMLO publicly, what we would probably call doxing a prominent journalist, revealing their salary, revealing personal details about them, which everybody took as a pretty direct threat for good reason. What is this situation with the free press in Mexico, and how does that kind of build into the constant corruption and the constant problems with the government that you don't have an accountable press that can get after the government?
So journalism, the press, and every aspect related to it, I think that everyone who lives in a democracy must admire. One can criticize it, one can be against what the journalist has said, but to have the president vehemently attack a journalist by revealing his salary in a country which we know has high criminality rates, high gang violence, in which he knows as president that 6 journalists have been killed, and to reveal his salary on live television, which was a high salary, tells you a lot about his motives. These aren't good motives. He's setting him up for violence, for theft, to being kidnapped. One never knows with the violence that goes up there. And sure, he's not going ahead and using policemen to kill Mr. Loret de Mola, the journalist, but he's certainly using his power to say, oh, maybe go ahead. And he said, I think I mentioned in the article where he said, if you attack me, you know what happens. What can you think about a president who does that, right?
You mentioned in here part of this, it's almost become a stick. I don't know how you would say that in Spanish, but it's part of his public rhetoric now to do those flourishes, the strongman routine. We've seen this with our own people. President Trump does this a lot. It's the wink wink kind of threatening stuff. It's the strongman stuff that you're alluding to. You mentioned in the piece that he kind of had a moment kind of similar. You compared it to Richard Nixon's "I'm not a crook" moment, but where he stood up and used a very specific term that folks in Mexico knew exactly what he was meaning, didn't he?
Yeah. So he uses the term, or he said, I'm not a cacique, a chieftain in many Native American tribes, especially there in Mexico. I'm not a dictator. And he said that as a candidate. So I compare it to Richard Nixon's "I'm not a crook" moment, because if you gotta say that as a candidate, it tells you a lot about his rhetoric, his persona, how he's acted, his proposals. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, let me give you another Latin American example for just a second. When he ran for president, I recall seeing an interview with Jorge Ramos, a brilliant journalist who asked him about his dictatorial aspirations. And Hugo Chavez used to say, no, we're going to work closely with the private sector. I believe in the private sector. I'm not a dictator. Dictatorship is what has happened before, even though Venezuela was a democracy when Hugo Chavez was elected president. And so I go back to what I was saying. If a president has to say that, or a candidate rather has to say that in the midst of a presidential campaign, it tells you that the people are scared, that he isn't trustworthy, and that his proposals, his rhetoric, his persona has been like that of a dictator, especially in a region that has been highly traumatized by the dictatorships that have happened over the years.
Yeah, is that what we're looking here? If you don't get some kind of an electoral defeat for him, at least for his party, if not for him directly, you already mentioned Hugo Chavez. We know that his replacement was as bad, if not worse. There's a long history in Latin America. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Noriegas. Pick whoever you want to. There's a long history of populist strongmen that turned into dictatorships. Is that really, what's the likelihood of that happening in Mexico right now with AMLO? Is that what we're really looking? Are we really one election away from him being a perpetual strongman that is going to be electorally untouchable?
So I believe the permanence of power of a single person, at least, is one of the characteristics of a dictatorship, but not the only one. He could perfectly leave power in the next elections because, well, presidential election is not viable under Mexican law. There is no way for immediate re-election, at least. I don't really know if there's way for re-election later on. But when has the impediment of presidential re-election been an impediment for dictators around the world? It has never been an impediment. Take a look at the last presidential polls. I've said before that I believe that making electoral calculations from now is highly and incredibly impossible. Context might change. We saw this with the coronavirus pandemic around the world, where elections suddenly gave us unexpected results. But in the last elections, AMLO got a 53% of people who voted for him. The polls show that support has grown to 60%, and that the second place goes to one of the traditional parties who goes just above 10% of the people who support them for the next presidential election. So once again, the permanence of power of a single person is not necessary for a dictatorship to be made, but the modern dictator gets to power through the system and then rigs it to his favor. What if Morena wins again and they go with all of the reforms that they want, having increased their majority in Congress, having penetrated the judicial power, maybe even the Electoral Institute in Mexico, which, apart from AMLO wanting to politicize it, he wants to federalize it, which means taking away the power that the Mexican states have and giving it to the federal government. Andrew, let me ask you this question. If you were the leader of a country in a hypothetical scenario and you wanted to remain in power, what would be the first reform that you would do?
Yeah, you consolidate power and you get a hold of the electoral process.
Exactly. So this is why we have to eye these reforms that AMLO wants to make in Mexico with a close eye. Because Latin America, as we've mentioned it many, many times in this interview, isn't foreign to the concept of a dictatorship. It's so worrying, so sad that the whole region has had this tradition of voting against their interests, the democratic interests. And here's a factor. Let me talk about the militarization of the country that has gone under AMLO. So back in Chile, for example, in the 1970s, Salvador Allende was elected president. He faced lots of opposition. His economy was crumbling. He wanted, or at least I think from an analysis point of view, that he wanted to consolidate power. And what did he do? He gave power to the military. Now, who was one of the people he gave power to? Pinochet, who we know was dictator from 1973 in the coup d'etat that happened in September 11 of 1973 and remained in power until the 1990s. Now, why do I mention this? AMLO has given too much power to the military in Mexico. More than 30 tasks have been given to the military under him that don't necessarily pertain to a military in Mexico and not in normal democracies. Control of ports, the construction of all parts of the Maya train, of banks, the construction, administration of hospitals and airports, and they have even attended crime. They were also the ones who rescued Bolivian dictator Evo Morales after there was electoral fraud in 2019, and the people ousted him out of power through protests, which tells you as well that he has been cozying up to dictators. Costa Rica, my beautiful country. Why do you think that we have such a beautiful democracy in the concert of nations and such a comparable example and some institutions to look up to? Because we have no army. The army doesn't exist. We can invest that money into education and health and the people, but more than that, we have healthy institutions, a healthy separation of power, strong branches, and no army.
Talking to Gabriel Salazar Singh. One last thought to kind of loop back where we started to bring a bow on this conversation. You talked about the people. The people as populists usually put these dictators in power because he tickles their ears and tells them what they want to hear. The only way you usually get rid of a dictator is the people have to rise up and take it back from them. The discouraging thing here, and you noted in your piece, though, is even though the Mexican people are very apathetic in their elections, like you said, they only had 20% turnout this last time out, projected to be that again or close to it. His personal popularity is still very, very high. How do you explain that discrepancy? Because the heart of the matter of whether this turns into a dictatorship or not for the country of Mexico, and that's our neighbor, we need to get along with them. We want them to be as healthy as possible because that makes our country better too. And it sure, at least at the very least, doesn't make more problems for us. Isn't that discrepancy kind of the heart of the matter of whether this is going to go dictatorship or not? And what do we do about it with that discrepancy of they're apathetic to vote, but they're still pretty popular for a guy who's clearly trending in an authoritative direction?
So there's the topic of his approval ratings. It was Wittgenstein, the philosopher, who said that truth is independent from perception. And the only truth here is that no dictatorship is good. Go to the Dominican Republic, or back then, for example, when Trujillo, the dictator who committed heinous crimes against his own people, was murdered, people suffered. Go to Chile, when Pinochet did a referendum on whether the people wanted or did not want for him to remain in power in the yes or no referendum, lots of people voted for him. Go to Argentina, you'll see the influence of Videla. Paraguay, the influence of Stroessner. So this Venezuela, Hugo Chavez is still a popular figure. So no dictatorship is good. And I've mentioned it before. It has been a fad or a tradition between Latin American countries to vote against their own interests, which are the democratic interests. But if we were to be like doctors, for example, and do a surgery and analyze the root problem, what would we see? That people are tired of corruption, they're tired of violence, they're tired of being lied to. And the result is that they vote for authoritarian figures who at the end of the day are much worse than the leaders who are elected democratically and leave power democratically and don't mess with the separation of powers.
Gabriel Salazar saying it's a universal thing that if you've got a country that's having economic and corruption problems, more freedom will cure those problems. Less freedom will perpetuate those problems. We'll keep an eye on our friends to the south in Mexico and the other countries in Latin and South America that perpetually have to struggle with this. frankly, in America, we need to pay attention to it because we're not doing great on it on our own front in a couple different ways. Gabriel Salazar saying outstanding stuff today. Really appreciate your time. We're going to have you back on, but until we get you back on, let folks know where you're writing, what you're working on, and what your social media is so they can follow you until we see you again on Heard Tell.
Right now I'm writing an article with the help of my friends over at Young Voices about the importance of liberalizing the economy and how that is in the interest of the poorer people, and the middle class and everyone really. And you can find my writings over at Twitter at Gabriel Sala Singh. So that's my name without the Salazar, just the Sala.
And his Twitter handle is on the screen graphic there if you're watching on the YouTube or the
Perfect.
Facebook page. Make sure you give him a follow. We joke about me being the oldest of the Young Voices, which is true. I am the oldest. I think he's the youngest. I can't believe how articulate and insightful you are. You've got a great future ahead of you, my friend, and we're glad to get in on the ground floor of it. Can't wait to talk to you again.
Thank you very much.
And,
Thank you very much. I love to be here.
And I just got to mention again, we were talking about it before I brought you on. That picture is spectacular. That's your grandfather over your shoulder. That's not him in one of the old time photos that you get at the amusement park. That's what I thought it was when I first saw it. That's actually his grandfather, the spitting image. Good looking family.
My grandfather and my beautiful mom, my beautiful grandma, and my grandfather, who was an admirable man, the man I look up to the most.
Yeah, my paternal grandfather, just a titan of a guy. I want to do a show. We should just do a show on our grandfather sometime. We'll bring you back and do that as a special, maybe.
I'd love that.
I'd love it too, my friend. Family gets it done. Gabriel Salazar Singh, Young Voices contributor. Great job, buddy. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
For the ones who know safety isn't a catchphrase, it's a culture. And the ones who help make sure everyone makes it home safe. For the safety-minded who watch everyone's backs, Grainger offers supplies and solutions for every industry, as well as safety assessments and training to keep your facilities safe and your people safer. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.